correspondents here, Trey Yanks. Now, he's been out there covering this war for the last several weeks. And over the weekend, he posted these couple of tweets. And I want to read them to you here. So this first one says, "We don't talk enough about the decisions civilians are forced to make during war. People leave their entire lives behind. They don't know if they'll ever return home." He also goes on to say, "It's the little things too, things we take for granted, having a routine, feeling calm, and knowing when you'll get your next meal. These are the things that war takes from innocent people." He also went on to say, and mental health. Imagine 1 week you're at home, your life feels relatively normal. The next week your city is literally on fire with bombs raining from the sky. That's what the Ukrainian population is facing today. That level of trauma often sticks with people for life. So as we continue this topic here on Live Now from Fox, I do want to welcome in trauma specialist and stress coach, Terry Lyles. He's joined us for several situations here on Live Now from Fox within the last several years. Terry, good morning to you. I wish we were speaking under better circumstances, but this is such an important topic as we cover this war overseas. My first question to you is, after seeing these tweets, after seeing some of this video, how do we even begin to talk about, how these civilians' lives will be forever changed by this situation?
Yeah, thanks for having me again, Regina. And, I wish it were different situations, but, war is traumatic, obviously, as you mentioned. And when families are going through situations like that, as it was mentioned by Trey, it's really hard to get your mind around. You're in your home one day, the next day you're in the streets, walking through your neighborhood, running to get someplace safe with whatever you can carry. That's really hard to do. And the issue is the survival mode. So we function in 3 levels: survive, function, and thrive. So I train athletes, professional athletes, corporate America on how to thrive, how to get to that zone state. These people are all in survival state. So they're running for their lives and their kids. So the very conversations they have amongst themselves is traumatic. And I've been in disaster zones around the world over the years. And let me tell you, it is not what you see on TV. It is much more intense. It's much more devastating. And it does leave psychological scars. Trust me.
Yeah, and Terry, when we talk about fighting out there, it's important to mention that civilians who have no military experience whatsoever now have machine guns and are fighting Russian troops for their country. We've played videos of engineers and doctors just out there getting as quick of training as they possibly could before they come into contact with those troops. So what can you say about how they've just been forced to really change their way of thinking? You talk about survival mode. What can you say about these people that have no experience and are now fighting?
Well, I mean, it's totally courageous, and the threat of war is one thing when it's outside of your borders and outside of your neighborhood and your country. When it's happening to you directly, we haven't seen anything like that on our soil since the Civil War and World War II outside of our borders, where people were trying to just protect their own homeland. So it's a very different thing. And for civilians to pick up arms, there's a lot of issues with that, using the weaponry, not having the ammo that they need, not having the advanced training that they need. But you know what? The really interesting thing about the human spirit is, if you put our families at risk, we will do whatever it takes to protect them, because that is that natural survival instinct that drives our flight challenge, which says, hey, I'm going to turn my fear into courage, which is 180 degrees apart, and I'm going to fight to protect myself, my homeland, and my family, even to the death. That takes some courageous people, and thank God there's still some courage out there when we're put with our backs against the wall.
Absolutely. And, I really want to touch on for a moment, Terry, children, because, I feel like we have these memories that really just create the person that we become. And, granted, a lot of these children that we've seen in some of these videos are babies, but some of them are young adults. They're either 10 to 13 years old, and their cities are being bombed. They're forced to pick up their lives and start over somewhere new or be separated from their family. What mental health impacts do you foresee this war having on some of these children?
I mean, I've done this kind of consulting and counseling for, a couple of decades, and I've actually worked with people through trauma that grew up in war zones around the world as kids, and it stays with them the rest of their lives. You just have to learn how to process it and continue to process it. Like most trauma in our lives, a lot of our military personnel that I work with come back from war with post-traumatic stress issues. It affects their mental health personally, their family health, their relationships, their friends. It affects everything that we do unless it's processed. So what I write about and train about is how to relieve that trauma, that it doesn't keep reverberating inside of our mind body capacity, on how to let it go. I saw this firsthand in Thailand after the tsunami, 9/11 at Ground Zero. And I would do trainings in office spaces and at Ground Zero where windows were still blown out with people in the room. And I'm trying to share with them why they're having nightmares and how to release that trauma so they can learn to sleep at night without the screaming in their heads. Young kids in Thailand that were in refugee camps who all their parents died because they were fisher people, and the tsunami took them while the kids were in the mountains playing. And I would go in and they would write letters, and they would, write those letters, and they would use paintings, and they would paint on cloth, and we'd hang it up and it would dry. And day after day, week after week, these kids started coming back to playing soccer again in the refugee camp, knowing that their parents are probably never going to come back for them because they didn't make it, but they had to learn how to recover from that. So the key to the stress recovery is how do we recover? And that's protecting our kids and trying to shelter them as much as possible.
And even going off of that, Terry, I actually have heard multiple stories of families and individuals having to leave elderly people behind because they were just too fragile or too frail to even begin that process of evacuating. What type of toll does that just take on your mind, knowing that you weren't able to save a loved one?
Well, I mean, that goes right back to the survival mode, and at some point, no one wants to have to be put in those situations, but in those kind of conditions, you have to decide what's best for the overall group, the family, in this case, a neighborhood. And it would be traumatic to leave our family members behind to get to safety. But those are the kind of sacrifices that unfortunately have to take place during wartime conditions, because if not, everyone dies in that neighborhood or that city. So those are tough decisions. And look, we're watching wives and children say goodbye to their husbands and boyfriends as they go to the front line to fight. So that kind of releasing is not easy, but just to know that there's going to be ongoing help and recovery necessary for these folks that are being in this trauma, not to mention the people here in the United States and around the world who are related to Ukrainians and Russians that are involved in the middle of that on the Ukrainian side. So there's a lot of hurt people out there and hurting people, but there's always a relief effort. And that's why I do what I do, and a lot of other mental health professionals trying to help people recover from trauma.
And Terry, you have a publication called Caught in the Crossfire talking about, war zone trauma, just like we're discussing right now. And something that stuck out to me was a strategy called gaining clarity within the crisis, almost trying to establish some sort of normal or working around the crisis in front of you. I want to show our viewers for 1 second a really amazing video of a wedding that happened over the weekend on the border of Ukraine. I'm going to let you see this for just a second.
Стосунки поцілунком.
Пане командир, будь ласка, візьміть. Так, кричайте.
Слава родині! Родині слава! Слава Україні!
Героям слава!
Слава нації!
Смерть ворогам!
Україна!
Понад усе!
Terry, that was just so incredible to me because obviously, like you and I, all of these people had plans. This couple obviously had plans to get married and still made it happen. So when you talk about, gaining clarity within the crisis, is this an example of that? And really, what advice do you have for people impacted overseas by this invasion in order to do so?
Yeah, that's an incredible clip. And that's exactly what I write about is, you have to find a new normalcy in the midst of chaos and crisis, in this case, war. And that's one example of, look, we're in the middle of a war. he may be going off to the front line, but let's get married before I go to show you how I think and feel about you. And we're going to go take care of our future here by what we do today. And finding that clarity is something that we can do in any situation. I work with people in all kinds of disaster zones, and you just don't know till you're there. But you mentioned something earlier about we have rituals that we do from day to day, and we go through our lives. We get up, we go to work, we eat meals. Now we don't go to work. Now we don't know when we're getting our next meal, and we just left home with a 30-second bag, as I call it. So our family all has a 30-second bag. But if something happened, there's a fire, we can grab at least one bag each, and we're out the door. That's what we need to survive with. It's not optimal, but it's survival. So I think as a result of that, we have to find ways to create new rituals and forms of psychological and physical protection in the midst of navigating even through a war zone or through a disaster zone in some cases. So it's really important. And we're designed, listen, the human spirit is designed to navigate. Our DNA is that. We're tough by nature. And sometimes we don't know how tough we can be until you're put in a situation. So this is what training helps do, whether it's military training with artillery and weaponry, or it's psychologically understanding how to walk through a family transition, in this case, a war situation. So training is the key, but creating new rituals in the midst of chaos is absolutely necessary for sanity.
Yeah, and I want to take it back home here for a second, Terry, because I feel like there's almost a sense of guilt when you talk about comfort. We actually saw that Russian boxer come back from the Ukraine, and he said to the media, I feel guilty that I left my country. And I feel like us as everyday individuals here in the U.S., we're waking up, we're having breakfast, we have a normal routine, and that's not what they have over there. So what advice do you have to everybody watching this invasion from around the world, wanting to help and, just feeling some sort of way about what's going on?
Yeah, trauma is very difficult to explain and not comfortable to experience. Even with all the training I've had and that I do with other people, going to disaster zones over the past 20 years, you never forget it. I can still smell ground zero. I can still see the bodies that were in Thailand and Haiti after the earthquake, the tsunami in Thailand. And, even with training, you still have to run your mind and your body capacities. And that's why I'm so passionate about writing and educating, even like this, that people can understand there is hope on the other side of trauma, but you have to go through the steps. And the steps are an ongoing, sometimes day-to-day, hour-by-hour process. And without understanding those steps, it's very dramatic, in a lot of our lives situation. And we don't realize sometimes how our life can break apart and splinter by that trauma that's locked inside of us unless we're, just processing it on a regular basis. So thoughts to the family, the friends, people here in this country, in Europe and other places watching, you do feel out of control. You do feel guilty. I've gotten off the plane many days from a disaster zone and felt wanted to go right back. I felt so guilty, and there was nothing I could do. And that is hard to process for the human mind. But listen, training is the key to allowing us to say, look, I did the best I could do with what I had then, and I'm going to go back when I can. But right now, I've got to get some recovery. And that is a key factor in this whole process.
Absolutely. And it does appear that this invasion could be far from over. We've got learning this morning that 1.5 million Ukrainians and counting have left their country, their lives being changed. So we will definitely continue to follow the emotional impacts, the traumatic impacts from this war over there. Terry Lyles, stress coach and trauma specialist, thank you so much for joining us here this morning as we talk about this really unprecedented situation. We'll definitely be chatting again soon.
Yeah, thank you, Regina. And for that download, it's a free download. It's on terrylyles.com. So anybody can get that and get it to anybody in the world. And it's free. So thank you for your efforts, Regina.
Absolutely. Thank you, Terry. Thank you so much.